And joining us now on the line from Montreal, Quebec, the former Prime Minister of Canada, Paul Martin. How are you tonight, Mr. Martin?
I'm fine. How are you, Mr. Bacon?
Excellent, and thank you. Well, please, you can't call me Mr. Bacon. Oh, my goodness. Let's get on to the broken financial architecture that we want to talk about here today. You recently gave a speech in which you called the global economic crisis, quote, a problem of unknown proportions. Do you still think that's the case tonight?
Yes, I do. I don't think that people, should have been all that surprised that the collapse of the U.S. housing market, the bubble, had an effect on U.S. financial institutions, although obviously the extent of it certainly got a lot of people out. But I think that what was really surprising was the degree, the exposure of risk that went beyond the U.S. national border. The collapse of the U.S. housing market causes the bankruptcy of small communities in northern Norway, a major credit crunch, the failure of banks in Europe as an example. And I think that really was the issue where, in fact, everybody got caught out, because I don't think people realized the degree of that cross-exposure to risk. But the point that I made in this particular speech was that the Financial Stability Forum, one institution that was set up during the Asian crisis when I was the finance minister at the G7, was set up to deal with this, and it really handled the whole thing reasonably well in terms of coordination. A lot of problems, but reasonably well. The problem with that institution, as well as a lot of the other institutions that we have set up, including the G8, is that it's totally American-centric, United States-centric, and Eurocentric. There are no Chinese permanent participants, no Indian permanent participants, no Brazilian permanent participants. And the question that I put in that speech, and that I would put essentially to you and I in this discussion, is we have just seen what happens when a major economy like the United States runs into trouble, and that the global financial community is so seamless that, in fact, it starts setting dominoes everywhere else. What's going to happen when a major hedge fund in China goes down? What's going to happen when India has a major mortgage meltdown? What's going to happen when some of these sovereign wealth funds speculate unwisely? And the fact is that we have not admitted those countries into these institutions. And I've got to tell you, Steve, that makes absolutely no sense.
There have been concerns expressed. Actually, I was going to get to this later, but since you're on it now, let's follow up. There have been concerns expressed, I think, that the G20, which you have been after for a long time, the creation of a new international institution, which would be able, presumably with greater alacrity and in a more efficient fashion, deal with these kinds of crises, would be too inefficient because it's too big and too unwieldy. You want to respond to that?
Well, that's just simply not true. The G20 finance ministers, which we set up at the time of the Asian crisis, in fact was called into play by the Treasury Secretary Paulson just the other day. And it's not unwieldy. It happens to have the major players at the table. These are all people who know each other. They are able to deal with it. And besides that, they reflect the reality of the world. To sort of say that it's too unwieldy to have the Chinese at the table, or to have the Indians at the table, or Brazilians, is simply nonsensical when you think that, in fact, their economies now rival the United States, now rival the major countries of Europe, and in a not too distant future are going to be much larger than any country in Europe. And so you can't pick the countries that should be there. It has to be the major powers. And if you're not prepared to dialogue with them, then I can tell you, we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult situation in a very short period of time.
Well, given that they're not major players in the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the G7 right now, should we infer from your comments that you believe that the current international financial architecture designed to deal with all of this mess is broken, completely broken?
No, I think it's just simply insufficient. The players who've got to deal with it are not at the table. I think that the fix doesn't take a stroke of genius. I said in the speech, it doesn't take a Nobel Prize winner to understand that you have to have China and India at the table, and you've got to have an ongoing dialogue. Let me just give you an example. We'll go back to the Financial Stability Forum, although you're quite right to focus on the G8 and the IMF. The Financial Stability Forum recognized that regulation can only go so far. and that you've got to have constant dialogue between central bank officials, regulators, to basically anticipate the kinds of problems that we've just seen and that will occur, new ones will occur in the future. Well, that dialogue builds up a familiarity, builds up an ability to deal with these kinds of things. And if you don't have the Chinese and Indians at the table, and they do have a problem in China, or they do have a problem in India of the kinds we've just seen in the United States, which history tells us is going to happen irrevocably, inevitably, then you will not be able to deal with that. And so the brokenness that you describe is one of a failure to understand that the major players have to be at a table on an ongoing basis. We recognize the Americans and the Europeans, the Canadians have to be, the Japanese have to be at the table on an ongoing basis. Why wouldn't we recognize the same thing for the emerging economies?
Let me pick up on your comment about regulation there, because Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary of the United States, whom you know, once said, when markets overshoot, policymakers must overshoot as well. And many economists have reminded us that it was government regulation in the 1930s that made a bad situation worse. So I wonder now whether you are concerned that as governments feel a need to play an increasingly urgent role in what's going on, whether they too may overregulate, overshoot, overdo it, in fact.
Well, that is always a danger. But I think that essentially where I think that the governments have to act is what the Americans have just done, following Gordon Brown's example of putting now massive amounts of money directly in to the stocks of their financial institutions. It was clear that the $700 billion package buying this toxic debt was not enough. I think that the Gordon Brown solution, what the Americans have adopted, is the right thing to do. There's not excessive regulation in that, but some people certainly would have said a month ago that was overshooting. I would not have said that. But the answer to your question is yes, and there's an ebb and flow in this. And that's why people have got to keep on talking. And that's why the Chinese and the Indians have to be at the table. The point is that you can only take regulation so far. The great genius of our system, of the market system, is that the ability of people to innovate. Sometimes they innovate a bridge too far. Regulation is way behind the freight train, and people have got to act, and that's what's happening here.
Some people in the United States, though, particularly among conservative Republicans, are extremely uncomfortable at the notion of the United States government taking such large multi-billion-dollar positions in some of these privately owned banks. Are you uncomfortable at that notion? No,
I'm not a bit. Our system is built on confidence. And in many ways, what we really need here are not economists, but we need psychiatrists to understand the psychology of the crowd. The financial industry is a crowd the same as any other crowd, and it's based on confidence. And if they don't have confidence, then they won't lend, the banks won't lend to themselves, they certainly won't lend to other people. And the only way in which that confidence could be reestablished is if they said, look, there is no danger in you lending to other financial institutions, and there is no danger in you lending to first-class credits, and this was the only way to establish it.
Let me ask this question to the man that Ralph Goodale the other day in Toronto introduced as the man behind the Maple Leaf Miracle, namely the guy who slew the deficit dragon, which was a pretty good introduction, and I bet you didn't mind that too much. Ralph was in rhetorical flight that day. Give our viewers, if you would, a bit of a tutorial here. The current financial system, the so-called Bretton Woods financial architecture, just, if you would, give us the Economics 101 description of what that means.
Well, what happened is at the end of the Second World War, at the same time that they were setting up the United Nations, they set up the United Nations systems, of which the Bretton Woods institutions are the major institutions. The Bretton Woods institutions are two, the IMF and the World Bank. And the division essentially was that the IMF was to deal with surveillance and financial shocks like we've just seen. The World Bank was essentially to deal with the softer side, that is to say the nations in the depths of poverty and how they could be helped. The problem was that those institutions were based on a very different world than the world we have got now. They were based on a rising Europe, a rising Japan over time, which gave us huge prosperity in the 50s and the 60s. Then we got into the 70s and a lot more difficulty. Then, and they didn't react all that well because the world had changed, and things like stagflation occurred and they weren't able to deal with it. And then, of course, what happened is the fall of the Soviet Union and the creation of the G1. The United States was the dominant force. Those institutions were able to go along, governed somewhat by the United States. The Mexican peso crisis was dealt with by the United States. And then the rise of China, India, Brazil. And that changed the whole ballgame. And what it really meant was that these institutions did not have a reasonable place at the IMF, did not have a reasonable place at the World Bank, and were shut out totally of the G8. And it was to deal with that that the finance ministers, and I was the first chair of the G20, brought them into this new organization. The problem is we didn't complete the job, and now we have to do that.
And you've been advancing that position for at least a decade, I think now, and yet it hasn't happened yet. Why, if the logic is so compelling, hasn't it happened yet?
Well, at the time of the Financial Stability Forum, I was a strong proponent that this should be created by the G7. I then raised the issue of bringing in these emerging economies, and so did others, and we got totally shut out. They said, look, you've created the G20, that's far enough. And the reason was that the European and American economies were so dominant that they felt that the other emerging economies were not in a position to make the kind of contribution that we felt that they had to. And also, I think there was a view that it was much easier to lecture at them from a high height if they were not part of the ongoing dialogue. Well, now that we see that these emerging economies have got most of the U.S. reserves, I mean, when Fannie Mae was bailed out in the United States and Freddie Mac, it's because the Chinese were, held an awful lot of that paper. I think that's over. And also, subprime means we can no longer lecture them. So sometimes it takes a crisis, in fact, to promote the kind of change. In fact, that's the real problem with the international system. It takes a crisis inevitably to promote the kind of change that has to occur.
You mentioned your friend Gordon Brown a moment ago, and I want to do a follow-up question on that. And this question will be from the Department of A Week is a Lifetime in Politics. It was only a couple of weeks ago that people were saying that he was a complete failure, he was indecisive, he was on his way to being thrown out of office, and now today he's being looked at as the kind of the new architecture, the savior, if you like, of the European financial system. He has led. Do you think, A, the world is paying attention, and B, that his prescription will pay off?
Yes, I do. He's a very close friend, and in fact, there was a small group of people, Larry Summers, Bob Rubin, all through this time of the Asian crisis, who spent a lot of time working together. Gordon is the only one who's left, and he is now the Prime Minister. There are very few people who have his in-depth knowledge of the international financial system. He was the head of the interim committee at the IMF for about 10 years. And so he has he has probably greater understanding than almost any other world leader of this, which is why he was able to do this. And I think the world is paying attention. Well, in fact, it's evident that they are, and I think that he is onto it. Now, this doesn't mean there aren't going to be further changes. This doesn't mean that there isn't going to have to be further evolution. We are in somewhat uncharted territory here, but I do believe that we're pretty close to the answer in terms of the banking system. Now, that doesn't mean that the real economy has been made right, and there's going to be a bit of a lag time there, and there may well have to be things that the world governments are going to have to do. But once again, I guarantee you that China and India, with those massive productive capacity, those huge and developing consumer markets, and those huge reserves of foreign currency, U.S. dollars primarily, are going to be part of the answer.
Mr. Martin, in our last minute here, I'm going to pat myself on the back for being incredibly well behaved and not asking you any smart-ass questions about what happened in this country politically last night. But I can't resist one little nonpartisan political question, and that's this. For the first time in 20 years, you're no longer a member of Parliament. How does that sit with you tonight?
Oh, well, I crossed that bridge some time ago, which is why I've been so involved in the Aboriginal issue. I'm involved in the whole question of the Congo rainforest, which is one of the largest rainforests, the second in the world. But I've also been spending a lot of time on the issues that we're talking about now. I mean, I had breakfast with Gordon Brown about a month ago. I've been in contact with people like Bob Rubin, who's very actively involved on the Democratic side in the United States. And so, this whole idea that you said we've been pushing for quite some time, for a decade, as it comes to fruition, I am spending a lot of time on it, and I continue to do it. But I've been I recognize that my departure from political public life has been over for a while.
And I'll invite people to come to our website at tvo.org to find out a little more about what you thought about last night, although not too smart, ask a question. Mr. Martin, it's good of you to join us on TVO on television tonight. Thanks so much and all the best.
Well, thank you for having me.